One word. That is the entirety of what I want to unpack today. Because sometimes the shortest possible answer in a negotiation says more than a 30-minute press conference ever could. A reporter in Ottawa asked Mark Carney a very specific, very loaded question. Would Canada make any more concessions just to get to the table with the United States? And Carney answered with a single syllable, no. That's it. No qualifiers, no diplomatic cushioning, no, well, it's complicated, no pivot to a longer explanation. Just the word itself delivered flatly, on his way into a caucus meeting like he was answering a question about the weather. And that one word, small as it looks on paper, quietly detonated a demand that Washington had been building for weeks. Here is what actually led up to that moment. Because you need the full shape of this before the one word makes any sense. Reporting out of Ottawa, sourced through Radio Canada, revealed that the Trump administration had been demanding what amounted to an entry fee from Canada. Not a formal treaty term, not something written into any legal document. An entry fee in the informal sense, meaning a set of concessions Canada would have to hand over just to be allowed to sit down at the table for the actual CUSMA renegotiation talks. Think about how that framing works. Before you even get to negotiate the real substance of the agreement, before tariffs on steel or aluminum or autos or lumber are even discussed, you first have to pay a toll simply for the privilege of showing up to the conversation. I want you to sit with how unusual that actually is because most people don't negotiate like this in their daily lives. And it can be easy to miss how strange the structure is when discover more standardized and admissions tests, terrorist translation tools, and resources. It's dressed up in diplomatic language. Imagine walking into a business negotiation and being told that before discussions can even begin, you first have to hand over something valuable, unrelated to the deal itself, just to earn a seat. That's not a negotiating position. That's a toll booth. And the entire point of a toll booth is that it doesn't matter how good your case is once you get inside the room because you already paid a price just to walk through the door. The demand didn't come out of nowhere. It came stacked on top of months of Canada already making real substantive concessions and getting very little in return. Ottawa had already dropped its digital services tax, a policy that had been a genuine irritant for American tech companies and had been treated by Washington as a major sticking point. Canada also pulled back or simply didn't proceed with a series of retaliatory tariffs that had been put in place in response to earlier American tariff moves. These weren't small symbolic gestures. These were real policy reversals, the kind that cost political capital domestically, the kind that opposition leaders in Canada seized on immediately as proof that the government was folding. And what did Canada get in exchange for all of that? According to Canadian officials themselves, those earlier moves were supposed to bring the two sides close to a deal on tariff relief last fall. That deal never fully materialized in the way Ottawa had hoped. So when the reporting emerged that Washington was now asking for even more, an additional round of concessions, simply to formally sit down and begin the CUSMA review talks, you can understand why the reaction inside the Canadian government was less patience and more fatigue. There's only so many times you can be told that the next concession is the one that finally gets you a seat at the table before you start asking whether the table actually exists. This is where Mark Carney's answer becomes worth examining closely because the context completely changes how you read that single syllable. A different kind of politician facing this exact question in this exact moment might have hedged, might have said something about remaining open to constructive dialogue, about weighing all options, about wanting what's best for Canadian workers while leaving the door cracked open just enough to walk it back later if the political winds shifted. That's the standard playbook. That's how these answers usually sound, filled with enough soft language that no single word can ever be quoted back at you as a hard commitment. Carney didn't do any of that. He said no. And I think the reason that single word landed the way it did comes back to something we've talked about before on this channel, which is who this man actually is, underneath the title of Prime Minister. Before politics, Carney spent his career inside central banks, institutions where the entire discipline is about saying exactly what you mean. No more and no less. Because markets move on the difference between a hedge and a commitment. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. He then became the first non-British citizen in 300 years to run the Bank of England, steering that economy through the prolonged uncertainty of Brexit. In both jobs, imprecise language wasn't just a communication problem, it was a risk to the entire financial system. You learn in that world that a clear no is often more valuable and more stabilizing than a soft maybe, because a soft maybe just invites more pressure, more testing, more probing to see where the real line actually is. So when Carney said no to more concessions, he wasn't improvising in the moment. That word was the product of an entire professional lifetime built around understanding that ambiguity gets exploited and clarity gets respected even when the person on the other side doesn't like the answer. Now, let's talk about why that demand for an entry fee existed in the first place, because I don't think it's useful to just say Washington was being aggressive and leave it there. There's a specific strategic logic behind this kind of pressure, and understanding it tells you a lot about how this entire negotiation has been designed from the American side. The theory behind an entry fee is simple. If you can extract value before the real negotiation even starts, you've effectively banked a win regardless of how the rest of the talks go. Even if the final CUSMA renegotiation ends up being balanced, even if Canada holds its ground on the substantive issues, Washington has already collected something up front. It's a way of making sure you never walk away from the table completely empty-handed because you took your cut before the table was even set. And there's a deeper piece to this that I think deserves attention, which is the language used by the US Trade Representative around this same period. In testimony before American lawmakers, the Trade Representative was asked directly about Canada's approach and responded with a comment that I think is more revealing than it first appears. He accused Canada of, in his words, doubling down on globalization, framing Canada's efforts to diversify its trading relationships away from over-reliance on the United States as being fundamentally at odds with what the current administration is trying to accomplish. He said, and I'm characterizing the substance here, that these are two models that don't fit together very well. One country trying to correct what it sees as the excesses of globalization while the other keeps building more of it. Sit with that framing for a second because it tells you something the entry fee demand doesn't say out loud. If Canada's strategy of building new markets in Europe and Asia is being treated by Washington as a problem, as something that needs correcting rather than simply a sovereign country managing its own economic exposure, then you start to understand why the pressure keeps escalating. A country that has no alternative markets is a country that has no real leverage in a negotiation because it has nowhere else to send its exports if talks collapse.